welcome back. And today, or this evening, we're going to talk about whether or not there is life after death. It's a question which many of you have been asking and which I haven't really gone into in any depth. So I thought that we would talk about it in a little more depth than we have been doing. This is going to be your course book. Is There an Afterlife by David Fontana. You can get copies for as little as £4 from Amazon, second-hand ones. So it's got a lot of information in it. David was a professor of psychology. He was a great friend of mine. He's dead now, and he will know for sure whether there's an afterlife or not. And David has written this book purely to put out the evidence for an afterlife. Now, what I have done is, and what we'll do in this talk, is I'll use his chapter headings to let us know whether or not there is truly an afterlife. Now, remember, it's going to be up to you to decide. I can give you the evidence, or some of it. You can look up some for yourself, and then you make your own decision. But let us just ask ourselves a question. Which bit of us is going to live? Our body? Well, no. That's put into the ground, or burnt to a crisp. If it's put into the ground, you remember the old child story about the worms. The worms go in thin and stagger out stout. So, yeah, obviously no afterlife there. What about the mind? Well, some people don't argue that there's no such thing as the mind apart from brain function. So if your brain has gone when you die, then the mind goes too, and that's it. And then there are those who say, well, maybe consciousness continues. Now, since there is no definition of consciousness, none of us understand consciousness, we can't really tell. And then there are those people who argue for a transcendent realm, and there is a transcendent component of us. Now, some of you will have had this experience of a part of yourself, usually a deep central core, possibly a feeling of light, that is never born and never dies. So the question of life after death just doesn't occur if you've had this experience, because you know that in some sense there's a part of you which is immortal. Now, the scientific evidence for that I might say is extremely poor. It's following really Lawrence van der Post, who, when asked did he believe in God, said, I don't believe in God, I know. These people have had the transcendent experience about this inner core of themselves, which goes on after death, will say exactly the same thing. I don't believe in a life after death. I know there is one. So, well, here we are then. David Fontana's book, and our question, is there an afterlife? David has absolutely no doubt that there is. So these are the contents of his book: evidence from modern parapsychology, evidence from apparitions, hauntings, mediumship, dropping communication, proxy cases, instrumental trance communication, reincarnation, and I'm going to add to that near-death experiences and death experiences. So let's start then with evidence from modern parapsychology. This would suggest that mind can exist independently from the brain. We know about telepathy, that you can pick up what other people think at a distance, and also they can pick up what you think at a distance. And we also know about clairvoyance, where you can see what there is at a distance, and there's some very good evidence supporting all that. So this would suggest then that mind isn't limited just to the brain. So it just raises a question in that area. Next, evidence from apparitions. Now, apparitions are really totally fascinating, because there is a lot of data on apparitions. And when the apparitions come, they are apparitions usually of somebody who's known to you, but not always. And they sometimes give you messages and tell you a little bit about what may be going to happen. So I think we've all heard apparition stories, and this again suggests, particularly if they're from people who are no longer living and have come back, and yet are able to give you data about what their lives are like in this new place, or what has been happening. So this is all evidence, I think, for it. Next, hauntings. Oh, hauntings I love. And we all have our own haunting story. In Scotland, where I am at the moment, just near us, there is a cottage that used to be haunted. And the people who bought the land took the cottage down stone by stone, and there is still the stories of the ground where the cottage is being haunted, and the person wandering around. Sadly, the cottage is gone. But I think the most interesting one from up here is the battle after the Battle of Culloden. The British, when the British beat the Scots, or the English beat the Scots, it was a very bloody battle, and the Scots were driven away from Culloden and caught and killed by the British. And a number of them, when they were running away or trying to escape, they came to a loch called Loch Ashy. And there, of course, they were killed by the British, by the English. And there are several accounts of people who've camped out near Loch Ashy and have heard the raging of the battle at night. Take those stories for what they are. And also, people locally do report on foggy evenings when they drive down the road, they see the British redcoats coming towards them. So hauntings are very common and have that sort of quality to them. Dropping communication is interesting. It means that if you have a medium, somebody who is not known to the medium, who's not known to the sitter, but is known that the sitter is related to one of their members, comes into the session and gives messages or information for the person through the medium. So this is an interesting avenue, and there's some really very complex drop-in stories which you can get in David Fontana's book. Proxy cases. This is interesting, where the person gives you information about somebody else. Now, I think one of the best ones that I know is Chico Xavier. Xavier is spelled with an X, X-A-V. Chico was a most interesting medium, and he lived in Brazil, and he was very involved with the Spiritist movement. He was an uneducated boy, but at the age of 15 he started writing really very high-class books, and he wrote 50 by the time he had died. He said that he was in fact transmitting these books from people who he could see around him, but nobody else could, of course, because it's through his mind. And he was used to find out information about various people. And the mother whose daughter was murdered went to Shiko and said, could he help and tell the mother who killed her daughter and where her body was. The police hadn't been able to make an arrest and didn't know where she was. So Shiko contacted the dead daughter, and she told him exactly where her body was, and she told him exactly how she'd been murdered, and what's more, she told him who had done it. So he gave this information to the mother, who gave it to the police, and sure enough, her body was there and the person was arrested. Now, Brazil is the only country that I know that in court, evidence from a medium like this has been used in the case against people who've offended against the law. So proxy cases are interesting. Instrumental transcommunication, I have quite a lot of difficulty with myself. Supposing you have an old radio and you turn the volume up, then you will hear a lot of noise. Now, some people say they can hear people speaking using this white noise to give messages. And I've heard some of these myself, and yes, I think I can persuade myself that this is so. But I don't find it terribly convincing. And another thing is that you can do it with video cameras, so you don't have the video camera trained on anything, but you just turn the gain up on the camera till you get all the background noise, and then within that, pictures appear. And the argument is that these are people who've died, and they're using this method to communicate. Well, you'll have to see some of this for yourselves and then make up your own minds. Next is reincarnation. Now, the evidence for reincarnation is, I think, fairly solid. You remember Stevenson, a professor in the University of Virginia. He found over 2,000 cases. Then what were they? They're people who had died, usually violently, been shot or run over. They had the stigmata of that injury on them when they're reborn, usually as birthmarks. And they also had memories of who they were and where their old family used to be, because they're usually reincarnated fairly close to where they died. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether Stevenson, in fact, was just being hoodwinked by the Indians. But if you look at his method of data analysis, it's absolutely impeccable. And I have absolutely no doubt that what he reported is in fact correct. But, you say, why are they mainly Indian? Why aren't there many in this country? Well, Jim Tucker has taken on Stevenson's role when Stevenson died, and he has found many, I think it's over 500, American cases of reincarnation. So they're there all around us. And I remember one of Tucker's, he talks about a boy, I think it's about age 3, who was always pretending to be a pilot. And then it was found as he got older that he could remember the aeroplane he was flying, when he was shot down, the name of the ship, and other details which give information about what happened at the time of his death, which he could never have got unless they had occurred in some sort of reincarnation framework. Near-death experiences, well, we've talked a lot about that. Going down the tunnel, being of light into the next world, meeting dead relatives. Interesting thing is the relatives are always in the prime of life, and any injuries to them are healed. And the argument is that the near-death experience are in fact meeting a continuation of the lives of the dead relatives. and then of course they come back and they tell us about this. So there's another line of evidence which you might like to consider. Now, the one which I find most interesting, and you could argue, yes, of course I would, because I've been working with these, are actual death experiences. By that I mean these are deathbed visitors as you're dying, a fortnight or so before. Dead relatives come and talk to you, and then some of the relatives will take you into a transcendental realm where you will experience transcendental phenomena like light and spiritual beings and love. And then you come back into the hospice where you can tell your relatives about it, and then you'll go again, and so on. It's as if it's an acclimatizing process. But also remember that as you come up to death and you have cleaned and cleaned and cleaned and cleaned yourself, what do I mean by cleaning? Giving up your attachments. So you can take nothing with you, so you give everything up. And then your ego structures in your mind start to change, and you enter another state of consciousness, which is called non-dual consciousness. And the evidence for this comes from some very excellent studies done by Monica Rentz in Switzerland. And there, the people who are dying go into a non-dual state and become part of the universe, if you like. So you can argue, if you want, that this is another. Well, there we are then. I've given you a very, very superficial run through of what David Fontana thinks is the evidence for an afterlife, and I agree with David that he's covered most of the major points. Do you believe in things like mediums? Do you believe that it's something which every culture in this world has thought exists? Or, well, almost every culture. Those certainly that have shamans, they all talk about afterlives. Are we to give any weight to that? And then, of course, there is, in this country, our own Christianity and the resurrection of Christ. That, again, is a point for an afterlife if you believe in the Bible and what it has to tell us. So there are all these factors which need to be considered. Now, some of you would like to ask what I believe or I think. Well, what I do when I come to this question is I weigh up the evidence, look at the scientific evidence, and see whether or not I think that it makes a good case for it. And doing that, I feel that it's very likely that there is an afterlife. And some of you may say, well, come on, get off the fence. You either believe or you don't believe. Well, I don't think it's quite like that, because the belief thing comes from the interpretation of the data, which other people may interpret differently. But yes, I think to all intents and purposes, there is some continuation of our individual selves after death. So there you have it. And I hope that has gone some way to looking at the evidence and dealing with the problem of what happens when we die. Thank you. Let's look at the way that David Fontana's life